My name is Zuri, and at 32 years old, I paused my entire life to care for my dying grandmother, while my family abandoned her. They left her for 3 years, while she lay suffering in a sterile hospital bed. Not one single visit, not one rushed phone call, not even a cheap card on her birthday. But the moment the high-priced attorney announced her multi-million-dollar inheritance, my mother, my sister, and my uncle burst into loud theatrical tears, as if they had been her devoted caretakers all along. Then the lawyer turned to the final page of the will, and every fake tear-stained smile in the room vanished. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Buckhead Law Office felt entirely too bright for a reading of a will. We were suspended 40 stories above the bustling streets of Atlanta, surrounded by polished mahogany and the suffocating scent of expensive leather. The air conditioning hummed quietly, chilling the room to a temperature that matched the coldness of the people sitting around the massive conference table. My Uncle Reginald sat at the head of the table, his posture radiating unearned authority. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire annual salary, projecting the image of a wealthy, successful patriarch, despite everyone in the room knowing perfectly well that he had not held down a legitimate job in over a decade. He was a man who lived off the family name, trading on the respect my grandmother had built from scratch, while secretly driving his own small business ventures into the ground through sheer incompetence. Next to him sat my mother, Beatrice. She was draped in a black designer morning dress that looked more appropriate for a high society gala than a legal meeting. A thick string of authentic pearls rested against her collarbone, and her wrists glittered with diamond bracelets that clinked loudly every time she moved. She was currently dabbing at completely dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue, sniffling loudly whenever the attorney paused his reading. She wanted to make absolutely certain that everyone in the room witnessed her performance of the heartbroken, grieving daughter. Then there was my older sister, Kiara, the undisputed golden child of the family. She sat directly across from me, her flawless makeup untouched by any actual sorrow, checking her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. Attorney Davenport, a stiff man with a monotonous voice and zero patience for family drama, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He began listing the assets of my grandmother Vivian, a legendary self-made titan of Atlanta commercial real estate. As he read off the staggering numbers, the heavy tension in the room rapidly morphed into palpable greed. You could practically see the dollar signs reflecting in my family members' eyes. The historic family mansion in Cascade Heights, valued at over $3 million, was to be transferred immediately to Beatrice. My mother let out a loud, shuddering breath, pressing a hand to her chest as if overwhelmed by the generosity she fully expected. Reginald let out a loud exhale of relief, leaning back in his expensive leather chair when he was named the sole inheritor of her commercial property management firm. It was a highly lucrative business he had been aggressively trying to get his hands on since I was a teenager. Kiara leaned forward eagerly, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table as she and her husband Sterling were awarded the fleet of vintage luxury vehicles and a cash trust of nearly $2 million. Sterling always portrayed himself as a visionary real estate developer, uplifting the Black community, but his only real talent was spending his wife's family money on flashy suits and expensive dinners to maintain a wealthy facade. $8 million in surface assets divided perfectly among the three people who had actively ignored the woman who built it all. They had not been there when her mind started to slip. They had not been there when she needed help walking, eating, or remembering her own name. But they were certainly here for the payout. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was a forensic accountant by trade, trained to look past the shiny surface, dig through complex tax returns, and spot the hidden discrepancies in any ledger. I knew how to track missing assets, uncover shell companies, and find the truth buried beneath piles of deceit. I watched their faces glow with arrogant triumph. They believed they had won. They had secured the legacy they believed they were entitled to simply by sharing her bloodline. Attorney Davenport shuffled his thick stack of legal papers and pulled out a small sealed manila envelope. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses with a brief flash of something resembling pity. "And to my granddaughter Zuri," the attorney read aloud, his voice dropping slightly. "I leave my safety deposit box at the downtown branch of the First National Bank and the single key required to open it." He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right in front of me. I calmly opened the flap and tilted the envelope downward. A heavy, dark, rusty key slid out, clinking sharply against the wood. That was it. No cash, no real estate, no shares in the lucrative family company, just a piece of oxidized metal. My mother let out a sharp, condescending laugh that broke the silence of the room. "A key to a box of her old knitting patterns, probably," Beatrice sneered, adjusting her pearls with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "You really thought she would leave you real money just because you played nursemaid for a few years? You always were painfully naive, Zuri." Before I could even process the insult, Kiara reached into her oversized designer handbag. Her manicured fingers pulled out a crisp white sheet of paper. She slapped it onto the mahogany table and slid it directly over my rusty key, her lips curling into a vicious smile. I looked down at the document. It was a formal 30-day eviction notice. "You have been squatting in Big Mama's historic West End house for 3 years," Kiara said, her voice dripping with venom and unearned superiority. "Sterling and I just got the deed to that property through the estate transfer. We are bulldozing that moldy shack next month to build luxury condos for his new community development project. You have until Friday to get your cheap scrubs and your depressing hospital smells out of our property." I stared at the eviction notice, my forensic mind cataloging the sheer cruelty of her words. I had lived in that West End house not as a squatter, but as a full-time dedicated caregiver. I had moved in when grandmother Vivian first got sick, giving up my own lease and my own independence to make sure she was never alone in her final years. I bathed her. I managed her complex schedule of medications. I sat up with her during the long, agonizing nights when she cried out in pain and confusion. My family had not stepped foot in that house in 3 years because the reality of illness was simply too unpleasant for their pristine, curated lives. "You did nothing but wipe spit up for 3 years while we were actually out here building the family legacy," Kiara continued, leaning across the table with a triumphant smirk. "Sterling needs that land cleared immediately. We have high-profile investors waiting, and we cannot have you dragging down the property value with your pathetic presence." I looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene, to perhaps suggest that throwing me out on the street just days after burying my grandmother was slightly extreme. Instead, Beatrice sighed dramatically and crossed her arms over her chest, siding with her golden child as she always did. "Do not be difficult, Zuri," my mother said sharply, her tone reprimanding me as if I were a misbehaving toddler. "You have always been so utterly selfish. You know perfectly well we had to empty your college fund years ago just to pay for Kiara's extravagant wedding to Sterling. That wedding secured our place in Atlanta high society. You are just a forensic accountant. You make a decent salary crunching numbers in a cubicle. You can easily rent a cheap apartment anywhere in the city. You do not need a historic home." The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavy in the air. She openly admitted to stealing my future, my education fund, to finance my sister's vanity project, phrasing it as if I should be eternally grateful for a financial sacrifice I never agreed to make. They sat there, 3 vultures picking at the bones of a fallen empire, fully expecting me to break down. They expected me to scream, to cry, to beg for a fraction of the wealth they had just stolen. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the family scapegoat shatter into pieces. But crying is an emotional reaction, and in my line of work, emotions only serve to obscure the data. Numbers do not lie, and neither does a rusted key left behind by a woman who is sharper, smarter, and far more cunning than all 3 of them combined. Grandmother Vivian never did anything without a very specific, calculated reason. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my favorite pen. Without a single word of protest, without shedding a single tear, I signed the eviction notice. My signature flowed smoothly and confidently across the harsh black ink of the legal document. I placed the cap back on my pen, picked up the rusty key, and stood up from the heavy leather chair. I smoothed the front of my blazer, looking down at the people who shared my blood but lacked my grandmother's brilliant mind. "Congratulations on your massive inheritance," I said, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. I smiled coldly, making direct, piercing eye contact with my sister, then my uncle, and finally my mother. "Just make sure you check the mailbox at the mansion very carefully. The IRS hates being ignored." The drive from the pristine glass towers of Buckhead down to the historic district of South Atlanta felt like crossing between two completely different worlds. I steered my modest sedan through the heavy afternoon traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a quiet, burning intensity. The heavy oxidized metal of the key rested inside my blazer pocket, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. My grandmother Vivian had not sent me to one of the sleek, modern financial institutions where my uncle Reginald and my brother-in-law Sterling loved to flaunt their VIP status. She had directed me to a formidable century-old brick building that sat stubbornly on a forgotten corner of the city. It was a legacy bank, the kind of institution that dealt in hard assets, generational secrets, and absolute discretion. I parked my car and walked through the heavy brass doors, presenting the rusty key to a stern-looking vault manager. He did not ask questions. He simply verified my identification matched the serial number on the metal and escorted me down a dimly lit staircase into the subterranean vault. The air down there smelled of ozone, old paper, and undisturbed dust. The manager unlocked the dual-cylinder mechanism of a large, weathered lockbox, pulled the heavy metal drawer free, and left me completely alone in a private viewing room. I sat down at the small metal desk and opened the box. There were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no sparkling diamonds or velvet pouches of gold coins. Inside lay a single thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. I opened the heavy cover and recognized Grandmother Vivian's immaculate cursive handwriting immediately. But this was not a diary of her feelings or a sentimental collection of family memories. As a forensic accountant, trained to track hidden money and untangle corporate fraud, I recognized exactly what I was looking at within the first 3 pages. It was a masterclass in financial surveillance. Grandmother Vivian had compiled a comprehensive, devastatingly accurate forensic audit of her own family. For 3 years, while she lay in that sterile hospital bed, while Beatrice complained about the smell of antiseptics, while Chiara refused to visit because the lighting ruined her selfies, and while Reginald claimed he was too busy managing the family empire, Vivian had been watching. And she had been tracking every single cent. My eyes darted across the columns of numbers, my mind effortlessly translating the data into a horrifying narrative of greed and betrayal. Sterling, the man who constantly stood at pulpits and charity galas preaching about building black wealth and uplifting the community, was a complete fraud. The ledger documented 5 years of systematic embezzlement. Sterling and Reginald had been bleeding Vivian's commercial property management firm dry. They had set up a labyrinth of offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, filtering the rental income from her historic properties through bogus vendor contracts and fake consulting fees. The money was not going toward community development. It was feeding Sterling's massive hidden gambling debts and funding Reginald's disastrously expensive lifestyle. But Grandmother Vivian was not a woman who allowed herself to be victimized. As I turned to the final section of the ledger, a cold chill of absolute awe washed over me. She had not just documented their crimes. She had built an inescapable financial prison for them. Knowing that her mind was perfectly sharp even as her body failed her, Vivian had executed a brilliant sequence of corporate maneuvers. Over the past 24 months, she had systematically cross-collateralized her entire visible empire. She had taken the historic family mansion in Cascade Heights, the property management firm, and the luxury vehicle fleet, and tied them all together as collateral for a massive, highly toxic commercial loan. She had borrowed $15 million against the very assets my family had just finished celebrating inheriting. I traced the interest rates and the balloon payment schedules written in her steady hand. It was a ticking time bomb. The loan was structured with predatory terms designed to trigger an immediate default and full repayment the moment the estate transferred ownership. The $8 million in surface wealth that Beatrice Reginald and Kiara thought they had just secured was nothing but an illusion. They did not inherit an empire. They had legally inherited a catastrophic, inescapable $15 million black hole of debt. I closed the heavy leather ledger, the brilliant cruelty of her strategy echoing in the quiet vault. I carefully placed the book into my leather tote bag, locked the empty metal box, and walked out of the bank. The Atlanta heat hit me the moment I stepped onto the pavement, but I felt nothing but ice-cold clarity. I needed to get back to my apartment, digitize the ledger, and prepare for the inevitable fallout. The drive back to my neighborhood took 30 minutes. I lived in a modest working-class complex, a choice that had always infuriated my mother. She believed my refusal to accept her money for a luxury high-rise was a deliberate insult to the family's social standing. As I walked up the outdoor stairwell to my second-floor unit, my professional instincts immediately flared. The heavy wooden door to my apartment was standing slightly ajar. The metal around the deadbolt was splintered and completely ruined. I pushed the door open, dropping my hand into my tote bag to grip the heavy spine of the ledger. My living room looked like the aftermath of a hurricane. Sofa cushions were thrown across the floor, my bookshelves had been completely emptied, and my desk drawers were pulled out and dumped onto the cheap carpet. Standing amidst the destruction of my safe haven were my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. Beatrice was still wearing her immaculate custom-tailored black mourning dress, completely unbothered by the fact that she was currently committing a felony. She stood near my kitchen counter, aggressively flipping through a stack of my personal mail. Kiara was pacing back and forth across my living room in 5-inch designer heels, her face contorted in a mask of absolute panic and rage. Sterling looked like a man who was actively experiencing a heart attack. He was sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie yanked down his chest, heaving as he tore through a stack of my financial textbooks. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, standing firmly in the doorway. Beatrice dropped the mail and spun around, her eyes blazing with that familiar condescending fury. "Do not use that tone with me, Zuri. We know what you did. I always knew you were a jealous, vindictive child, but this is a new low even for you. You decided to live like a peasant in this miserable little box, just to punish me, refusing the beautiful condo I offered you. And now you decide to destroy your sister's life out of pure spite. You offered me a condo with my own college fund that you stole to pay for Kiara's wedding flowers," I replied smoothly, stepping fully into the room and kicking the splintered door shut behind me. "And I pay my own rent here because I refuse to be a puppet on your financial strings. Now I will ask you one more time before I call the police. Why are you vandalizing my home?" Sterling suddenly charged across the room, closing the distance between us in 3 frantic strides. He stopped mere inches from my face, his breath smelling of stale coffee and absolute terror. The polished, charismatic community developer persona he wore for the cameras was completely gone. He was shaking, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What did you do?" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with panic, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "What did you do to the estate?" Kiara rushed forward, grabbing Sterling's arm while glaring at me with raw hatred. "You ruined everything. We just got back to the mansion from the lawyer's office. The bank was waiting for us. There was a representative from the commercial lending division sitting in our driveway." Sterling reached into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, crumpled packet of legal documents. The paper was heavy, stamped with the red ink of a major corporate lender. He raised his arm and threw the heavy packet violently. The papers hit my chest and scattered all over the floor, covering my cheap rug and notices of default, immediate payment demands, and intent to foreclose. "Read it," Sterling roared, pointing a shaking finger at the mess on the floor. "The bank is saying the estate owes $15 million. They are seizing the company. They are seizing the mansion. They are going to take the cars. They said the loan went into default the second the title transferred to us today." I looked down at the papers, my face an unreadable mask, though my heart was pounding a steady, triumphant rhythm. The trap had sprung perfectly. "You are a forensic accountant," Sterling yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. You were the only one who had access to her hospital room day and night. You were the only one managing her affairs while we were out working. You forged her signature on those commercial loans while she was in a coma, didn't you? You jealous bitch. You stole $15 million from this family and strapped the debt to our inheritance. I looked at Sterling. His face was a violent shade of crimson, beads of sweat tracking through his expensive cologne. I stared at the foreclosure notices scattered across my cheap carpet, and a sound erupted from the very bottom of my chest. I laughed. It was not a nervous giggle or a polite chuckle to ease the tension. It was a deep, resonant laugh that bounced off the thin drywall of my apartment. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 3 agonizing years changing bedpans and administering morphine while her family partied only to finally watch the scales of justice balance themselves. Sterling actually took a step back, recoiling as if my laughter was a physical blow. His jaw worked silently for a second before his rage boiled over again. You think this is funny? He snarled, his hands shaking so violently that his heavy gold watch rattled against his wrist. You bankrupt the family empire, you destroy the legacy we built, and you stand there laughing. I stopped laughing, letting the cold, analytical part of my brain take over. I stepped over the scattered bank notices, closing the distance between us until I was standing toe-to-toe with my towering brother-in-law. I did not forge a single document, Sterling, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I am a forensic accountant. I do not create the numbers. I just follow them. And Grandmother Vivian was not in a coma when she signed those loan agreements. She was perfectly lucid. I know this because she executed the entire $15 million cross-collateralization strategy herself, right there from her hospital bed. I simply audited the books she left behind in her safety deposit box. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew she was strapping a financial time bomb to the assets you were all drooling over. The air in the room grew completely still. The reality of my words hung over them like a guillotine. Before Sterling could form a coherent response, a blur of black fabric and glittering diamonds moved in my peripheral vision. My mother Beatrice lunged forward. She swung her arm with a vicious, practiced speed, her open palm connected with my cheekbone. The sharp edge of her massive diamond cocktail ring sliced across my skin. The crack of the slap echoed through the small living room like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side from the force of the impact. The metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth where my teeth had bitten into the inside of my cheek. I stood perfectly still, letting the stinging heat radiate across my face. I did not raise a hand to touch the wound. I just slowly turned my head back to look at the woman who gave birth to me. You ungrateful wretch! Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with a hysterical, venomous fury. Her chest heaved under her designer mourning dress. I knew I should have left you with your deadbeat father. I should have let him drag you down into poverty instead of raising you in my house. You have always been a dark cloud over this family. You are just mad because Kiara married a prominent real estate mogul who is actively uplifting the Black community while you sit alone in a miserable apartment looking at spreadsheets. You are a jealous, bitter little girl who wants to destroy what she cannot have. Her words were designed to cut to trigger the deep childhood wounds she had spent decades inflicting. But standing there tasting my own blood, I felt absolutely nothing. The mother I had wanted to please had died a long time ago. The woman standing before me was just another hostile creditor. I spit a small drop of blood onto the floor, right onto one of the bank notices. Then I shifted my gaze from Beatrice to the man she was so desperately defending. Uplifting the community. I repeated smoothly, my voice as sharp and precise as a scalpel. I tilted my head, looking Sterling up and down, taking in his ruined suit and his terrified eyes. Sterling, do you want to tell your wife about the offshore shell companies in the Caymans, or should I? Sterling froze. The last remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. What are you talking about? Kiara demanded, stepping out from behind her mother. She clutched her expensive Birkin bag against her chest like a protective shield. She looked at me, then at Sterling, her voice trembling slightly. Sterling, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying. I did not wait for his answer. I kept my eyes locked on Sterling, dismantling his entire life piece by piece. You really thought Grandmother Vivian was too senile to notice the bleeding balance sheets, I said, taking a slow step toward him. You thought she did not see the fake consulting invoices you and Uncle Reginald were generating? You have been embezzling from the family business for 5 straight years. But you were not pouring that money back into affordable housing or community centers, were you, Sterling? You were funneling it through a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. You were using Big Mama's historic commercial properties as your own personal piggy bank to pay off your private high-stakes gambling debts. Shut up, Sterling hissed, looking frantically at Kiara and Beatrice. Do not listen to her. She is making this up. She is trying to deflect from what she did. I am not making up the wire transfers to the Bellagio VIP casino. Sterling, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. I am not making up the offshore accounts. Grandmother Vivian tracked every single penny you stole. She knew you were a parasite. That is why she tied the $15 million debt to the assets she left you. She made sure that the moment you inherited the company, you also inherited the consequences of your own theft. The bank is not foreclosing because of me. The bank is foreclosing because they found out you have been using fraudulent collateral to fund your gambling addiction. Kiara let out a sharp gasp. She dropped her designer handbag. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling expensive cosmetics and car keys onto the carpet. She stared at her husband, waiting for him to erupt in righteous indignation, waiting for him to prove me wrong. But Sterling could not look her in the eye. He stared at the floor. His broad shoulders slumped, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. The silence was an absolute, undeniable admission of guilt. No, Kiara whispered, her voice shaking violently as denial washed over her. She shook her head, refusing to let her perfect high society illusion shatter. No, that is a lie. Sterling is a pillar of this community. He builds things. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who wants to drag everyone down to your level. You forged those documents. I know you did. Kiara was spiraling, clinging to the gilded facade of her marriage because the alternative was admitting she was married to a criminal. She took a step toward me, raising her hand as if she was going to mirror our mother and strike me across the face. Before she could close the distance, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. A harsh, rhythmic flashing light suddenly pierced through the thin blinds of my living room window. Brilliant streaks of red and blue swept across the walls, illuminating the shocked faces of my family members. The heavy, unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming shut echoed from the parking lot below. Heavy boots began pounding up the exterior metal staircase of my apartment building. The timing was too perfect, too orchestrated. I stepped back, my forensic mind analyzing the new variable. The front door, which Beatrice had splintered open moments ago, was pushed wide open. Uncle Reginald stood in the doorway. He looked immaculate. His custom-tailored suit was perfectly pressed, his tie impeccably knotted, and his silver hair brushed back with absolute precision. He did not look like a man whose company was actively facing a $15 million foreclosure. He looked like a man executing a flawless, predetermined strike. Flanking him on either side were 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers. Their hands rested casually but deliberately on their utility belts. They scanned the room, taking in the overturned furniture, the scattered papers, and the tense standoff between my family and me. Reginald stepped into the room with the easy, arrogant confidence of a man who owned the entire city. He had spent decades cultivating his elite connections, hosting charity dinners and shaking hands with judges and politicians. He knew exactly how to weaponize his respectability. He looked at me with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. "Officers," Reginald said, his deep, authoritative voice filling the small apartment. He raised a perfectly manicured hand and pointed a single steady finger directly at my chest. "That is her." The officers stepped past Reginald, their expressions hardening as they focused their attention entirely on me. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing in a split second that the ambush was not just about confronting me over the foreclosure. It was a coordinated legal assassination. They had planned this before they even kicked in my door. "My niece has been deeply unstable for years," Reginald continued speaking to the officers in a calm, reasonable tone that painted me as a complete lunatic. She isolated my mother from the rest of the family. We have reason to believe she physically abused my mother in her final days. While my mother was under heavy sedation and completely incapacitated, Zuri forced her to sign fraudulent commercial loans that have financially devastated our estate. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain the ledger in my bag, to expose Sterling standing right next to me. But Reginald did not give me the chance to speak. He moved in for the final fatal blow. And earlier today, at the reading of the will, she stole a bank key belonging to the estate, Reginald said, his voice laced with righteous indignation. She used it to access my mother's private files. She is a danger to this family and a flight risk. Arrest her. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around my wrists with a heavy final sound. The two Atlanta police officers did not listen to a single word I said. They did not care about the offshore accounts, the embezzlement, or the fake collateral. Uncle Reginald had spoken, and in Atlanta, a man wearing a custom suit with his level of social capital was automatically treated like the ultimate authority. My mother and sister watched with barely concealed satisfaction as I was escorted out of my own apartment. I held my head high. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. The ride to the Fulton County Jail was a blur of flashing lights and harsh reality. My family was not just greedy, they were lethal. They had orchestrated this entire ambush to neutralize the only person who knew their secret. I spent the night in a freezing holding cell surrounded by concrete walls and the echoing sounds of despair. The air smelled of sweat and old institutional bleach. But I did not panic. I sat on the hard metal bench and ran the numbers in my head, calculating my next move with the same precision I used for my corporate clients. The moment the sun came up, I used my one phone call to reach a bail bondsman. I drained my emergency savings account, the one I had built penny by penny during my years of wiping down hospital trays and managing my grandmother's care. It was the money I had painstakingly saved after Beatrice drained my college tuition fund to pay for Kiara's wedding flowers. I posted my own bail, signed the release papers, and walked out into the humid Georgia morning. My clothes were wrinkled, and I had not slept in 24 hours, but my mind was completely focused on survival. I needed my high-powered forensic accounting software to crack the rest of the ledger. I caught a ride directly to my accounting firm in Midtown. I walked into the sleek modern lobby completely exhausted, but fiercely determined. I walked up to the security turnstile and swiped my employee badge. A harsh red light flashed. Access denied. I tried again, wiping the magnetic strip on my blazer, assuming it was a glitch. Denied. A heavy hand fell on my shoulder. I turned around to find my managing partner, David, flanked by two bulky corporate security guards. He looked at me with an expression of pure disgust. My stomach dropped. I asked him what was going on, demanding to be led up to my desk. David coldly informed me that my employment had been terminated effective immediately. He told me he had received a personal phone call from my Uncle Reginald and my brother-in-law Sterling early that morning. They had not just called to complain. They had weaponized their elite social networks to destroy my livelihood. Reginald had used his high-ranking position on the regional board of Jack and Jill, while Sterling leveraged Kiara's powerful Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority connections. They systematically contacted every senior partner at my firm. They framed me as a dangerous, unstable elder abuser who was currently under active criminal investigation for defrauding a dying woman. David practically spat at me as he ordered security to escort me off the premises. He warned me that if I ever stepped foot in the building again, he would press trespassing charges. Just like that, the career I had sacrificed my youth to build was burned to ash. I stood on the sidewalk outside the glass building, completely stripped of my professional identity. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a barrage of text messages from former friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. I opened my social media apps and immediately understood the sheer scale of the coordinated attack. Kiara had launched a digital war. She had taken to Instagram Live and Black Twitter, leveraging her massive following of Atlanta high society influencers. I watched a video of my sister sitting in the grand parlor of the family mansion. She was wearing a flawless vintage black Chanel morning dress, her makeup done to mimic absolute devastation. She was crying perfectly calibrated tears, dabbing her eyes as she stared tragically into the camera lens. She told her hundreds of thousands of followers that her mentally unstable, deeply jealous sister had systematically isolated their beloved grandmother from the rest of the family. She painted a horrifying, completely fabricated picture of me, holding Big Mama hostage, financially abusing her and forcing her to sign fraudulent loan documents while she lay in a medically induced coma. In the background of the video, I could see Beatrice weeping softly, playing the role of the shattered matriarch to absolute perfection. They knew exactly how to perform for an audience. They knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative to protect their own guilt. The comment section was an absolute bloodbath. Atlanta's black elite, the megachurch pastors, the politicians, and the wealthy socialites were all expressing their disgust and outrage. They completely canceled me. I was branded a monster and a thief. My family had masterfully weaponized their pristine public image to destroy my credibility, ensuring that if I ever tried to expose their massive financial fraud, absolutely no one would believe me. The entire city was united against me. I had no job, no apartment, and a ruined reputation. But my family made a critical miscalculation. They assumed taking away my comfort would break my spirit. They forgot that I was the one who had survived for 3 years sleeping on a hard vinyl chair in a hospital room while they drank champagne at country clubs. I walked to a cheap roadside motel off Buford Highway and paid for a room with the last of my cash. The room smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach, but it had a locking door and a functioning power outlet. I was not going to be a victim. I walked to a nearby electronics store, purchased a cheap burner laptop, and went straight back to my motel room. I set up a makeshift war room on the flimsy laminate desk. I carefully pulled the thick leather-bound forensic ledger from my tote bag. I began manually digitizing every single page of Grandmother Vivian's immaculate notes. I needed my high-tier software, so I hacked into my own cloud-based forensic server, bypassing the security locks my former firm had tried to put on my personal accounts. I fed the raw data into the system and let the algorithms go to work. I sat for hours tracing the intricate, massive web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and toxic commercial debt my grandmother had brilliantly orchestrated. I began mapping out the exact structure of the $15 million trap. I was going to find every single vulnerability in Sterling and Reginald's financial history. I found wire transfers to private accounts, illegal distributions of company funds, and property deeds that had been secretly altered. Grandmother Vivian had left me a treasure map, and I was going to use it to bury them all. I did not need public approval. I only needed the math to be correct. I was completely engrossed in a spreadsheet mapping Sterling's illegal wire transfers to a casino in Macau when a sharp, aggressive knock rattled the cheap wooden door of my motel room. I froze. I glanced at the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was just past 4 in the afternoon. I assumed it was the motel manager demanding a credit card on file, or perhaps the housekeeping staff doing their rounds. I carefully slid the leather ledger under the thin mattress of the bed and walked over to the door. I peered through the scratched peephole and saw a man in a plain gray suit, holding a thick manila envelope. I opened the door just a fraction of an inch. The man immediately shoved the envelope through the crack, hit my chest with it, and stated that I had been officially served. He turned and walked rapidly down the outdoor corridor before I could even process what had happened. I locked the deadbolt, tore open the envelope, and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. It was an emergency subpoena for Fulton County Probate Court. My Uncle Reginald was not just trying to put me in jail. He was initiating a scorched earth legal campaign. He had filed an emergency injunction to officially invalidate my professional certified public accountant license. He was moving to freeze every single one of my personal bank accounts. And the very last page of the document contained a court mandate ordering me to legally surrender the forensic ledger and the rusty key by 8 o'clock the next morning, or face immediate imprisonment for contempt of court. The heavy reinforced oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse swung open, sealing me inside a sterile corridor of polished marble. It was exactly 7:45 in the morning. I carried my cheap leather tote bag, the rough nylon straps digging fiercely into my shoulder, the weight of the digitized files, and my rusted bank key pressing against my side. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes burned from staring at the glowing screen of my burner laptop all night, tracing the intricate financial web my grandmother had woven. My posture was rigid, locked into place by pure adrenaline and the absolute certainty of my own forensic math. I bypassed the crowded wooden benches in the hallway, ignoring the curious stares. When I finally pushed through the swinging double doors of courtroom 4B, the visual assault was immediate and infuriating. My family had arranged themselves like a Renaissance painting of tragic grief. They occupied the entire front row behind the plaintiff table, a solid wall of wealth and manufactured sorrow. Uncle Reginald sat perfectly straight, in a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light overhead. He looked every bit the weary, heartbroken patriarch burdened by a sudden family tragedy. Beside him, Beatrice wore a high-necked black dress that easily cost more than my first car. She was clutching a monogrammed lace handkerchief, occasionally dabbing at dry eyes. Kiara and Sterling completed the tableau, holding hands tightly, their heads bowed in silent prayer. Sterling had traded his sweat-soaked, panic-stricken demeanor from yesterday for a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a respectable community leader. Standing at the mahogany podium was Arthur Vance. He was an absolute shark of a litigator, a man whose exorbitant hourly rate could bankroll a small country. Reginald had clearly not spared a single expense to crush me. Vance adjusted his gold watch, straightened his silk tie, and addressed Judge Morrison. The judge was a formidable, stern-looking woman known throughout the Atlanta circuit for her absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding courtroom antics. Vance did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He immediately launched into a devastating, meticulously crafted character assassination. He presented me to the court, not as a concerned, dedicated granddaughter who had given up years of her life to act as a primary caregiver, but as a predatory, unhinged opportunist who had preyed upon a helpless, dying elderly woman. To support his vicious narrative, Vance produced a thick, professionally bound stack of medical records. He slapped them onto the judge's elevated bench with theatrical, practiced flair. These documents, he claimed with booming authority, proved unequivocally that grandmother Vivienne had been kept under heavy sedation for the last 3 years of her life. He argued that she lacked any semblance of legal or physical capacity to authorize basic living expenses, let alone execute complex commercial loans or restructure a $15 million corporate real estate portfolio. According to Vance, I had deliberately and maliciously isolated her from the loving embrace of her devoted family. He painted a terrifying picture of a sociopathic accountant barring grieving relatives from a hospital room so I could orchestrate a massive financial fraud in her name, forging her signature to steal millions. Then Vance called Kiara to the stand. My sister ascended the short wooden steps to the witness box with the fragile grace of a wounded swan. She swore on the Bible, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. When Vance asked her to describe my character and our shared history, Kiara unleashed a performance worthy of a prestigious acting award. She looked directly at Judge Morrison, a single glistening tear escaping her eye and rolling slowly down her flawlessly contoured cheek. She testified that I had always been deeply vindictive, a dangerous, toxic presence lurking in the shadows of their happy, loving home. Zuri has always been consumed by a dark, obsessive jealousy. Kiara sobbed, gripping the wooden edges of the witness stand until her knuckles turned white. She has spent her entire life trying to destroy my happiness, just like when we were undergraduates at Spelman College. She intentionally sabotaged my sorority rush because she was not chosen by the chapter. She spread vicious rumors about me to the chapter president just to ruin my chances, all out of pure spite. She could not stand to see me succeed, and now she is doing the exact same thing to our grandmother's legacy. She wants to see us all homeless and destitute on the streets of Atlanta. The sheer audacity of the lie, the casual way she twisted my years of sacrifice into a narrative of petty sibling rivalry, snapped the final shred of my restraint. I did not care about strict courtroom decorum. I did not care about the armed bailiff stepping aggressively toward my table. I slammed my hands down on the defense table and shot to my feet, my chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. I did not sabotage your sorority rush, I shouted, my voice cutting through her manufactured sobs like a serrated blade. I refused to write your final senior thesis for you anymore because I was working 2 separate jobs to pay my own tuition while Mom bought you a brand new luxury sedan. You failed out of the rush process because your grades completely tanked the exact second I stopped doing your homework for you. Order in this court, Judge Morrison bellowed, grabbing her heavy wooden gavel and slamming it down with a deafening crack. Miss Anderson, you will remain silent or I will have you physically removed from this room and placed in a holding cell immediately. Do you understand me? You will speak only when spoken to. I stood there, my chest heaving, locking eyes with the furious judge. I slowly lowered myself back into my rigid wooden chair, forcing my breathing to steady. Kiara dabbed her eyes with a tissue, casting a terrified glance at the bench, playing the role of the abused sister to the end. Arthur Vance rested his case with a smug smile. He looked immensely satisfied. He had successfully agitated me, prompting an outburst that perfectly aligned with his narrative. He had painted me as a volatile, jealous sibling prone to explosive anger. The narrative was seemingly set in stone. Judge Morrison adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at me from her elevated bench. Her expression was completely devoid of sympathy or understanding. Her eyes held nothing but profound, icy disdain. She had bought their performance entirely. She looked at a woman who lived in a cheap working-class apartment, who had just been unceremoniously fired from a respectable accounting firm, and who was currently facing an active criminal investigation for elder abuse. Then she looked at the pristine, wealthy, prominent family sitting together in the gallery, exuding respectability and civic virtue. The class divide in the room was undeniable, and the judge had clearly already made her decision. I could read it in the hard, unforgiving set of her jaw. Miss Anderson, the judge, began, her voice dripping with cold authority. The evidence presented before me today by the plaintiffs is deeply disturbing. The medical documentation clearly indicates that your grandmother was in no physical or cognitive condition to execute the complex financial maneuvers you allege she performed. Given your complete lack of legal representation today, your lack of verifiable evidence, and your highly disruptive behavior in my courtroom, I find the plaintiff's request for an emergency injunction entirely appropriate. I am prepared to grant the motion to officially freeze all of your personal bank accounts. Furthermore, I am ordering you to immediately surrender the original physical ledger, all associated digital files, and the safety deposit box key directly to Mr. Vance by the end of this hearing. Failure to comply will result in an immediate ruling of contempt, and you will be remanded to the custody of the Fulton County Sheriff. The courtroom was dead silent. I could hear the faint, triumphant exhale of breath from Beatrice sitting in the front row. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully buried the truth under a mountain of expensive litigation and fake tears. I stood up. I did not shout this time. I did not display a single ounce of the volatile anger Arthur Vance had tried to pin on me. I smoothed the front of my cheap blazer, picked up my tote bag, and looked directly into Judge Morrison's eyes. "Your Honor," I said calmly, my voice steady, approaching the bench. "I do not have the original financial documents, but I do have a flash drive. You see, Grandmother Vivian was not in a coma the whole time, and she knew exactly who was visiting her." I stared at Sterling's mouth as he formed the words, the sheer brazen evil of his expression burning itself into my retinas. The courtroom around me erupted once again, not with outrage this time, but with the chaotic shuffle of dismissal. The elite spectators were whispering furiously, trying to reconcile the horrific audio they had just heard with the judge's swift procedural dismissal of it. The bailiff stepped closer, shaking the plastic evidence bag impatiently. "Miss Anderson," the bailiff said, his voice rough and commanding, The items, now. I looked down at the table. My burner laptop sat closed. The silver flash drive was still plugged into the quartz interface. The rusty key felt like a lead weight burning a hole in my pocket. If I surrendered the ledger, and the key, Reginald and Sterling would destroy them before the sun set. They would wipe the Cayman Shell companies clean, shred the fake consulting invoices, and silence the only physical proof of their $15 million embezzlement. They would inherit the estate, bury the debt, and leave me facing criminal elder abuse charges with absolutely no evidence to defend myself. I slowly reached into my pocket. My fingers brushed the rough, oxidized metal of the key. I pulled it out, feeling the eyes of Arthur Vance tracking my every movement. I picked up the flash drive from the clerk's desk. I held them both over the open plastic bag. Then I stopped. I did not drop them. Instead, I closed my fist tightly around the metal, my knuckles turning white. I looked back up at Judge Morrison. Her face was set in a mask of stern impatience. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the rising noise of the departing gallery. "The injunction orders me to surrender the documents to the plaintiff's counsel. But it does not address the primary creditor of the estate." Judge Morrison frowned, leaning forward. "Excuse me. Arthur." Vance stepped up to the podium again, his shark-like instincts flaring. "Your Honor, the defendant is stalling. I ask that she be held in contempt immediately and taken into custody." I ignored Vance entirely. I kept my gaze locked on the judge, my mind racing through the complex matrix of banking regulations, probate law, and corporate liability. I was a forensic accountant. I knew how money moved, and more importantly, I knew how banks reacted when their money was threatened. "The $15 million commercial loan that my grandmother executed is currently in default," I stated, speaking rapidly, laying out the financial architecture for the court. The loan was structured with a trigger clause upon the transfer of the estate. That transfer occurred yesterday. The moment my uncle and sister officially inherited the properties, the loan accelerated. The bank is currently foreclosing on the entire estate. Vance slammed his hand on the podium. "Objection, relevance. This has absolutely nothing to do with the emergency injunction regarding the theft of private documents." "It has everything to do with it," I countered, my voice rising to match his volume. "The bank is the primary secured creditor. They hold the lien on the mansion, the commercial properties, and the business accounts. If this court orders me to surrender the ledger to men who have a vested documented interest in destroying it, the court is actively facilitating the destruction of evidence vital to a federal bank fraud investigation." Reginald shot out of his chair, his pristine composure finally cracking. "That is a lie," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "There is no bank fraud. She is making this up to keep the documents." I turned to Reginald, a cold, predatory calm settling over me. "Is it a lie, Uncle Reggie?" I asked, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Did you not use the historic Cascade Heights properties as collateral? Did you not inflate the rental income on those properties using fake vendor contracts to secure a higher loan amount? Because inflating revenue to secure a commercial loan from a federally insured bank is a violation of Title 18, Section 1344 of the United States Code. It is federal bank fraud, and the penalty is 30 years in federal prison." The courtroom fell dead silent once again. The word federal carried a weight that even Reginald's elite local connections could not easily brush away. Vance was visibly sweating now. He looked at Reginald, realizing for the first time the sheer scale of the liability his client might be facing. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this is wild speculation. The defendant is attempting to litigate a hypothetical federal case in a state probate court. I demand she surrender the items immediately." Judge Morrison sat back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. She was a strict proceduralist, but she was not a fool. She knew that if she ordered the destruction of evidence related to a massive federal banking crime, her own career could be compromised. "Miss Anderson," Judge Morrison said, slowly measuring her words, "are you stating under oath that the ledger you possess contains evidence of federal bank fraud?" "I am, Your Honor," I replied without hesitation. "And I am stating that if I hand this ledger to Mr. Vance, it will be destroyed to protect his clients." Vance opened his mouth to protest, but the judge held up her hand, silencing him instantly. She looked at the bailiff. "Bailiff," Judge Morrison ordered, You will take possession of the flash drive, the physical ledger, and the safety deposit box key. You will place them in a sealed, tamper-evident evidence bag. They will not be surrendered to the plaintiff's counsel. They will be placed in the custody of the court, secured in the court's vault pending a formal review. Vance looked horrified. Your Honor, my clients have a legal right to those documents. Your client's counselor have a legal right to due process. Judge Morrison snapped. And if there is even a fraction of a chance that those documents contain evidence of federal bank fraud, I am not going to be the judge who hands them over to be shredded. The items remain in court custody. This hearing is adjourned. She slammed the gavel down. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat. It was a stalemate. The evidence was safe, locked away where Reginald and Sterling could not touch it. I dropped the flash drive and the key into the bailiff's extended plastic bag. I watched him seal it tightly. I turned back to my family. Beatrice was still sitting in the front row, looking pale and utterly defeated. Kiara was staring at Sterling with a mixture of terror and disgust. Sterling looked like he was going to be physically sick. Reginald's pristine mask was completely gone, replaced by a look of panicked desperation. I picked up my cheap tote bag and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. As I passed my family, I did not stop. I did not gloat. I simply looked at Sterling, who was sweating profusely, his hands shaking as he clutched the edge of the table. I smiled a small, cold curve of my lips. Checkmate, I whispered. I pulled the silver flash drive from my pocket and bypassed Arthur Vance, whose smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. I handed the small metal drive directly to the court clerk. Judge Morrison glared at me, her hands folded tightly together, but raw curiosity clearly warred with her rigid judicial impatience. She gave a sharp nod, instructing the clerk to plug the device into the court's audio-visual system and play the primary file. The heavy courtroom speakers crackled with a burst of static, followed immediately by the rhythmic mechanical hissing of a hospital ventilator. It was the unmistakable sound of my grandmother's intensive care room. Then a voice cut through the sterile noise. It was Sterling. If she holds on for another month, the bank will trigger a mandatory audit on the commercial property group. Sterling's recorded voice echoed through the courtroom, completely stripped of all his usual polished pulpit charisma. We need to tell the doctors to pull the plug, Reggie. We need her dead by Friday, so the estate transfers to us before the feds look at the books. Uncle Reginald's voice answered low, calm, and utterly calculating. The living will give Beatrice medical proxy. I will make sure she signs the do not resuscitate order tonight. We cannot afford a federal audit. The courtroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. The sound of gasps, outraged whispers, and shifting bodies bounced off the high marble walls. I turned around to look at my family. Kiara was staring at Sterling in unadulterated horror, her hands trembling so violently that her designer clutch fell to the floor. She backed away from her husband as if he were a loaded weapon. Beatrice had slapped both hands over her mouth, her face drained of all color, her entire body shaking in her expensive mourning dress. The pristine, untouchable image of the grieving, unified family had just been detonated in front of Atlanta's most elite spectators. But Arthur Vance was worth his exorbitant retainer. He did not panic. He slammed his hand onto the mahogany podium, his voice booming over the chaos of the gallery. "Objection, Your Honor," Vance roared, his face flushed with manufactured outrage. Georgia law explicitly requires two-party consent for any audio recording in a private space where there is a reasonable expectation of privacy. That hospital room was a private space. Neither my client nor Mr. Sterling consented to this recording. It is an illegal wiretap, a felony under state law, and it is completely inadmissible in this civil probate court. Judge Morrison grabbed her heavy wooden gavel and banged it repeatedly against the sounding block, silencing the chaotic gallery. She looked at Vance, then looked down at me. The rigid proceduralist in her took over, completely ignoring the horrific moral implications of the tape. "Sustained," Judge Morrison declared coldly. "The audio recording is an illegal wiretap and is struck from the record entirely. Miss Anderson, you are strictly prohibited from referencing it further in this courtroom. The emergency injunction stands. Bailiff, confiscate the defendant's electronic storage devices and the physical ledger immediately." The armed bailiff stepped forward. He grabbed the flash drive from the clerk's terminal, then marched over to my table and snatched my cheap tote bag. He ripped the heavy leather-bound forensic ledger from inside and handed it directly to Arthur Vance. I stood there physically stripped of my single piece of leverage. Vance smiled smoothly, handing the ledger back to Reginald. Beside him, Sterling adjusted his suit jacket, his panic completely evaporating. He looked me dead in the eye, a sickening, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "You lose," Sterling mouthed silently. The defeat was absolute. I walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse with nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of systemic failure. The drive back to my cheap roadside motel on Buford Highway was a blur. The room felt even smaller now, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and institutional bleach suffocating me. I sat on the edge of the lumpy, sagging mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper while eating cold, cheap takeout lo mein out of a styrofoam carton. I had lost the ledger. I had lost my job. My professional license was under review. My personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the court order. I was financially paralyzed. My phone screen lit up on the scarred nightstand. I reached over and opened a local news application. My family was not wasting a single second. Reginald and Sterling had immediately launched a massive, highly coordinated press tour to capitalize on their courtroom victory. They were plastered across every local news channel, wearing matching bespoke suits, playing the role of the merciful, forgiving family who had just survived a traumatic ordeal with a deeply disturbed criminal relative. Sterling stood at a podium adorned with the gleaming gold logo of his mega church, his charismatic community developer persona fully restored for the cameras. To honor the incredible legacy of Grandmother Vivian and to prove that our family remains firmly dedicated to uplifting the Black community, we are announcing a massive community revitalization gala. Sterling declared, his voice ringing with fake practice passion. We will be raising millions of dollars for affordable housing and urban development. I threw my phone onto the bed in disgust. It was a complete farce. They were going to use the gala to launder the stolen money, mixing clean donor funds with their embezzled cash, to artificially inflate the estate accounts and cover their tracks before the bank executed the foreclosure. I buried my face in my hands, rubbing my exhausted eyes. I refused to let them win. I needed a new angle. I needed something that was not contained in the confiscated physical ledger. I closed my eyes and forced my mind to travel back to Grandmother Vivian's hospital room. I visualized the sterile white walls, the beeping heart monitors, the smell of rubbing alcohol. I remembered sitting beside her bed for hours, holding her frail hand, while the rest of the family ignored her. I remembered her humming. Grandmother Vivian used to hum a specific rhythmic sequence of numbers. She did it constantly under her breath, staring blindly at the acoustic ceiling tiles when she thought no one was paying attention. 8, 2 pause, 4, 5 pause, 1, 9, 0. I had always assumed it was a hymn, or perhaps a meaningless side effect of the heavy pain medication affecting her cognitive function. But Grandmother Vivian was a brilliant corporate mastermind. She did not do anything without a specific, calculated reason. I scrambled across the bed, grabbed my cheap burner laptop, and flipped the screen open. My fingers flew across the keyboard. 82-45. That was not a hymn. It was the exact formatting structure of an IRS employer identification number. I fired up my proxy servers and launched a deep web search protocol. I ran the 9-digit sequence through the Georgia Secretary of State corporate registry and cross-referenced it with federal tax databases. My forensic accounting instincts kicked into overdrive, my eyes scanning endless lines of code shell company registrations and metadata. The number hit a match. It belonged to a secondary, completely obscure holding company registered in Delaware. A company that was entirely missing from the primary ledger Reginald had confiscated. Grandmother Vivian had built a failsafe. She knew they might take the physical books, so she hid the most radioactive asset in plain sight. I hacked into the public tax filings associated with the employer identification number, bypassing basic security firewalls with practiced ease. The Delaware holding company had only filed one major document in the last 3 years. It was a UCC-1 financing statement, a public legal form that a creditor files to give notice that it has an interest in the personal property of a debtor. It is the holy grail of tracking hidden corporate debt. I downloaded the PDF file and opened it. My jaw dropped. The math staring back at me was absolutely staggering. Sterling had not just embezzled from my grandmother's commercial property firm. That was just the tip of his fraudulent iceberg. He had stolen exactly $5 million directly from his own megachurch's building fund. He had wired the church donations straight to an offshore gambling syndicate in Macau to cover his massive spiraling losses. But that was not the most devastating part of the document. The bank had required a secondary guarantor for a withdrawal of that magnitude. Sterling had forged the loan guarantee documents. He had put Kiara down as the sole legal guarantor for the entire $5 million debt, completely without her knowledge. He had legally strapped his own wife to federal wire fraud and massive corporate liability. Kiara was not just married to a criminal, she was his legal fall guy. If the church ever audited the building fund, Kiara would be the one going to federal prison. I stared at the glowing screen, the sheer, ruthless brilliance of my grandmother's surveillance washing over me. She had documented everything. She had left me the exact weapon I needed to destroy Sterling's pristine public image and sever his greatest familial alliance. I minimized the PDF and reopened the local news broadcast on my browser. Sterling was still speaking at the press conference, his polished, gleaming smile flashing under the bright camera lights. The Community Revitalization Gala will be held this Saturday night at the St. Regis Atlanta, Sterling announced to the gathered reporters, adjusting his expensive silk tie for the cameras. It will be a $5,000 a plate event bringing together the finest minds and the most generous hearts in our city to raise funds for our community. I slammed the burner laptop shut. I did not have access to my frozen bank accounts, but I still had my emergency credit card, the one tied to a completely separate, untraceable shell account I had set up years ago for my own personal security. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the dingy motel room. I drove straight to Phipps Plaza in Buckhead. I ignored the questioning, judgmental looks of the high-end boutique clerks who stared at my wrinkled clothes and tired eyes. I walked into the most expensive designer store in the plaza and walked out with a sleek, custom-tailored blood-red evening gown. It was a dress designed to turn heads, command attention, and signal absolute warfare. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the boutique's dressing room, running my hands over the heavy, luxurious silk. The woman staring back at me was no longer the exhausted, victimized accountant they had kicked out of the courthouse. She was an executioner. I slipped the red dress into its heavy garment bag, my eyes cold and focused. Time to go to church, I whispered to myself. The humid Atlanta night air clung to my skin as I parked my rented sedan 3 blocks away from the St. Regis. The luxury hotel loomed against the skyline like a towering fortress of old money, exclusive privilege, and impenetrable social armor. I grabbed my garment bag from the back seat and slung a heavy canvas duffel over my shoulder. The duffel contained my burner laptop, a tangle of specialized data cables, and a few high-grade signal splitters. I did not walk toward the grand front entrance lined with eager valets and imported European sports cars. I headed straight for the service alley in the back. I had spent years auditing massive hospitality management firms. I knew exactly how their staffing protocols worked, how the underbelly of these glittering events operated, and how invisible the working class was to the people paying for the ballroom. I pulled a laminated caterer identification badge from my pocket. It was a flawless forgery, courtesy of a high-end color printer at a local shipping center, and 5 minutes of digital manipulation earlier that afternoon. I walked up to the heavy steel security door, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I swiped the barcode against the employee scanner. The light flashed green. The heavy door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. I stepped into the chaotic, echoing belly of the hotel's main catering kitchen. Dozens of chefs, sous chefs, and waiters rushed past me in a frantic blur of white uniforms. They were carrying heavy silver trays of seared Wagyu beef truffle blinis and perfectly arranged hors d'oeuvres. The air smelled of roasted garlic and burning stress. I kept my head down, marching forward and matching their frantic pace. I blended in perfectly as just another face in the invisible army serving the elite. I navigated the maze of stainless steel corridors, dodging rolling carts and shouting managers until I reached the executive guest restrooms just off the main lobby. I locked myself inside a sprawling marble-lined handicap stall and unzipped the garment bag. I stripped off my cheap street clothes, the physical markers of my defeat, and stepped into the blood-red evening gown. The heavy silk hugged my frame like a second skin. The color was a stark, violent contrast to the sea of conservative black, muted gold, and tasteful ivory I knew waited for me outside these doors. I pinned my hair up in a sleek, severe style, pulling it tightly away from my face. I applied a dark crimson lipstick, treating the makeup exactly like war paint. I was not hiding anymore. I was not the victimized, exhausted accountant they had humiliated in probate court. I was the architect of their destruction. I packed my street clothes and the forged catering badge into the canvas duffel bag. I shoved the bag deep under the bathroom sink counter, hiding it behind a stack of extra paper towels, where the cleaning staff would not look until the event was over. I grabbed a small, sequined clutch containing only my phone and my silver flash drive. I took one last look in the gilded bathroom mirror. My eyes were completely devoid of fear. I looked dangerous. I looked ready. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Astor Ballroom and stepped directly into the belly of the beast. The sheer suffocating opulence of the event hit me like a physical wave. The room was dripping in white orchids and gold leaf accents. Towering floral arrangements cascaded down from the center of every dining table, illuminated by massive, sparkling crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pristine white gloves floated gracefully through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays stacked with flutes of vintage champagne. My forensic accountant brain immediately began running the numbers. The venue rental, the imported orchids, the top tier catering, the open bar. This single evening cost easily over $200,000. It was an absolute masterpiece of manufactured philanthropy, completely funded by the money they had stolen from a dying woman. Atlanta's black elite had turned out in full force to kiss the ring. I recognized the mayor sipping a martini near a massive swan-shaped ice sculpture. I saw 3 different megachurch pastors laughing uproariously with regional bank executives. Local politicians, wealthy socialites, and aggressive real estate moguls were busy exchanging business cards and air kisses, desperate to attach their names to the evening's prestige. They were all here to blindly hand over their money to my family, eager to buy social capital wrapped in the guise of charity. I glided into the room, snatching a crystal flute of champagne from a passing waiter, without breaking my stride. I did not skulk in the shadows near the back walls. I walked straight through the dead center of the crowd. The vibrant, bleeding red of my gown parted the sea of dark suits and pastel dresses like Moses at the Red Sea. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Whispers ignited in my wake, spreading through the ballroom like a localized wildfire. I kept my posture impossibly straight, a serene, completely unbothered smile playing on my lips. I commanded the room without saying a single word. Across the ballroom, positioned strategically near the main stage, I spotted the royal family holding court. Beatrice was playing the role of the devastated but deeply resilient queen mother to absolute perfection. She was dripping in a ridiculous amount of diamonds. A sparkling multi-carat choker wrapped around her neck, a piece of jewelry that undoubtedly cost more than a suburban house. She was nodding sympathetically, adopting a tragic, brave expression as an older, wealthy politician offered his condolences. Just feet away, Kiara was holding a glass of sparkling water, aggressively gesturing with her left hand, so every single person in her vicinity could see the heavy, solid gold Rolex shining on her wrist. It was a brand new timepiece. She was flaunting the spoils of her husband's embezzlement. Sterling was busy shaking hands with a group of wealthy corporate investors, radiating the polished, blinding charm of a trusted visionary. I took a slow sip of my champagne and let my eyes lock onto Beatrice. It only took a few seconds for her to notice the sudden flash of crimson disrupting her perfect, carefully curated aesthetic. She glanced over the shoulder of the politician she was talking to. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. The polite, grieving smile slid off her face entirely, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. She abruptly excused herself from the conversation, her movements stiff and jerky. She marched aggressively across the ballroom floor, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she closed the distance between us. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging fiercely into my skin, and dragged me forcefully toward a secluded alcove hidden behind a towering velvet curtain near the ballroom entrance. "How did you get in here?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage, keeping her volume low so the surrounding wealthy guests would not hear her losing her temper. "Security will throw you out in handcuffs. You are a disgrace to this bloodline." She glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. "You have absolutely no right to show your face in polite society after what you tried to do to us in court today. You are a sick, twisted girl, and I will personally make sure the police drag you out of this hotel through the service elevator." I did not flinch. I did not try to pull my arm away from her bruising grip. I simply looked down at her hand gripping my bicep, then looked back up into her furious, panicked eyes. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating for her. "Enjoy the caviar, mother." I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, sharp and cold as shattered glass. "It is going to be your last meal in high society." Beatrice recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. She dropped my arm, taking a sudden step back. "You are insane," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You have nothing. You lost everything this morning. You are a broke, unlicensed failure." I smiled warmly at her, tilting my head. "Call them," I challenged her softly. "Call the police right now, mother. Let us see who leaves this ballroom in handcuffs tonight." Doubt flickered wildly behind her eyes. The absolute, unshakable certainty in my voice terrified her. She knew I was a forensic accountant. She knew my brain functioned on data, not emotion. Before she could formulate a response, a sharp electronic tone rang out over the massive ballroom speaker system. The main overhead lights abruptly dimmed, plunging the opulent crowd into a hushed, dramatic twilight. A single brilliant white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the grand podium at the front of the room. Behind the podium, a massive wall-to-wall LED screen flickered to life, displaying a beautifully rendered high-definition logo for the Vivian Estates Community Trust. Sterling stepped out from the shadows and walked confidently to the center of the stage. The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. He adjusted the microphone, bowing his head in a flawless show of deep, manufactured humility. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Sterling's rich baritone voice echoed through the vast ballroom, commanding absolute attention. "We are gathered here to honor a legacy of profound giving and to launch a multi-million-dollar initiative that will change the face of affordable housing in Atlanta." As the investors, mayors, and pastors turned their attention entirely to the stage, mesmerized by Sterling's magnetic pitch, I turned my back on my mother. I slipped out of the alcove and moved silently down a narrow, unlit service corridor flanking the main hall. I bypassed a pair of distracted catering managers who were busy arguing over wine pairings and walked briskly up a short flight of carpeted stairs. I pushed open a heavy black door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I quietly stepped into the AV control booth. A single exhausted-looking technician sat in the dark room wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones. His back was to the door as he managed the complex audio feeds and visual projections for the ballroom below. He was completely focused on his glowing mixing board. I reached into my sequined clutch and pulled out the silver flash drive. The trap was set. The audience was captive. The execution was about to begin. The air inside the control booth was frigid, humming with the low, steady vibration of massive server racks and cooling fans. The isolated technician remained entirely oblivious to my presence. He was hunched over the main lighting console, his head bobbing rhythmically to whatever music was blasting through his heavy, noise-canceling headphones. His attention was completely glued to the sophisticated lighting cues required for Sterling's grand presentation. I moved behind him with the silent, deliberate precision of a ghost. My eyes scanned the complex array of digital inputs and video switchers patching directly into the ballroom's massive LED display screen. I located the primary media feed. I bypassed the hotel's standard presentation laptop and plugged my silver flash drive directly into the master projection terminal. A small green light blinked to life on the side of the drive. The system immediately recognized the external device. I pulled up the digitized file folder I had meticulously compiled in my cheap motel room. I cued the high-definition images, keeping them paused just a fraction of a second away from broadcasting live. Then I let my gaze sweep across the technician's workstation. Resting next to a stack of crumpled run-of-show documents was a spare heavy-duty wireless microphone. It was powered on its digital frequency synced to the ballroom's primary audio array. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal grip slide perfectly into my palm. I kept my thumb hovering over the active broadcast switch. Through the thick, soundproof glass of the control booth window, I possessed an unobstructed bird's-eye view of the extravagant ballroom below. The ambient lighting faded into a dramatic, hushed darkness. A crisp, brilliant white spotlight snapped onto the main stage. Sterling walked into the center of the blinding beam. He looked immaculate. His custom-tailored tuxedo fit him flawlessly, and he carried himself with the magnetic practiced swagger of a man who firmly believed he was untouchable. He smiled warmly at the sea of wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and influential religious leaders. "We are gathered here tonight, not merely to mourn a profound loss, but to celebrate a magnificent beginning." Sterling's deep, resonant voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. He paced slowly across the stage, making deliberate, meaningful eye contact with the wealthiest donors in the front row. My grandmother-in-law, the late Vivian Anderson, was a pioneer of Black excellence. She understood that true lasting power does not come from hoarding wealth. It comes from circulating it. It comes from lifting up our neighborhoods, providing safe havens for our families, and investing directly in the future of our people. He paused, allowing a perfectly timed wave of polite, appreciative applause to roll through the audience. Reginald nodded sagely from his VIP table. Beatrice dabbed her dry eyes with her lace handkerchief. "That is why tonight I am honored to officially announce the Vivian Estates Community Trust." Sterling continued, his voice rising with manufactured evangelical passion. He spread his arms wide, looking directly at the row of megachurch pastors sitting just below the stage. "Pastors, I see you. I know the struggles your congregations face daily. We are going to build those community centers. We are going to fund those affordable housing units. We are going to create a fortress of generational wealth that no economic downturn can destroy. This project is about faith. It is about family, and it is about financial empowerment. Please direct your attention to the screens to see the future of our community." Sterling turned dramatically toward the massive 20-foot LED wall spanning the back of the stage. He extended his hand, waiting for the hotel technician to cue the glossy, expensive architectural renderings of the fake housing project. I did not hesitate. I pressed the enter key on the control console. The giant LED screen went completely black for a microsecond. Then, instead of a beautiful watercolor rendering of a community center, a stark, high-contrast image of an official bank statement flashed across the 20-foot display. The document was magnified to a massive scale, the numbers crisp and undeniable. It was a wire transfer receipt from a notorious offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Down in the ballroom, a wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. Sterling froze, his extended hand dropping slowly to his side. He squinted at the screen, assuming the AV team had simply loaded the wrong corporate slide. He tapped the microphone. "Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. We seem to have a slight technical." I hit the right arrow key on the keyboard. The slide changed. A new, highly magnified document filled the screen. This time it was an internal banking ledger I had extracted from the UCC-1 financing statement. I had taken the liberty of using my forensic software to draw a thick, bright red digital circle around a specific routing number. It was the primary operational routing number for the mega church building fund. A second bright red circle highlighted the destination account. It belonged to a dummy corporation registered exclusively under Sterling's name. A third circle highlighted the exact transfer amount: $5 million. I hit the arrow key again. The evidence began to cycle in a rapid, devastating sequence. The screen flashed a verified receipt from the Bellagio VIP High Roller Suite in Las Vegas, showing a single night's gambling loss of over $400,000 paid directly from the church's stolen funds. The next slide revealed a wire transfer to a luxury exotic car dealership in Miami, detailing the purchase of 2 custom imported sports cars. The dates on the casino markers and the dealership invoices perfectly matched the dates Sterling had claimed he was away on spiritual retreats and church business. The polite confusion in the ballroom instantly transformed into an atmosphere of absolute volatile shock. The profound silence shattered. A prominent megachurch pastor in the front row stood up so violently that his heavy dining chair crashed backward onto the marble floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at the massive LED screen. "That is our building fund," the pastor roared, his voice carrying over the rising panic. "That is the routing number for our youth center. You stole our money." Investors began scrambling out of their seats, pulling out their smartphones to capture the damning evidence flashing on the stage. The elegant, sophisticated crowd descended into chaos. Beatrice leaped to her feet, her hands clutching her diamond choker as if she were suddenly struggling to breathe. Reginald's face drained of all blood. He turned frantically toward the control booth, screaming at the hotel staff. Sterling was entirely paralyzed. The slick, charismatic visionary was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal staring at the public broadcast of his own financial execution. I stepped out of the dark control booth and walked onto the plush, curved balcony that directly overlooked the grand ballroom. The red silk of my gown caught the ambient light from the massive chandeliers. I flipped the active broadcast switch on my wireless microphone. "Sterling isn't building a community," my voice thundered through the ballroom's primary audio system, instantly drowning out the shouts and panicked conversations below. Every single head in the room snapped upward toward the balcony. The hotel spotlight operator, completely bewildered by the sudden change in the program, instinctively swung his beam away from the stage and illuminated me. I stood bathed in blinding white light, my red dress blazing against the dark velvet curtains of the upper tier. "He is paying off loan sharks," I declared, my voice steady, sharp, and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "He has spent the last 3 years hemorrhaging cash to an offshore gambling syndicate in Macau. He did not build a housing trust. He stole $5 million in tax-exempt donations directly from the pockets of your working-class congregations to cover his own toxic debt. And he used the church's money to do it." Sterling snapped out of his paralysis. His eyes locked onto me standing on the balcony. Total panic seized him. "Turn it off!" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he waved his arms at the terrified hotel staff. "Cut the microphone. Turn off the screen. Security, get her out of here." Inside the booth, the technician finally realized what was happening. He lunged for the mixing board, frantically hitting buttons and sliding faders in a desperate attempt to sever my audio feed. But I had engaged the digital administrative lock on the console before stepping outside. The microphone remained completely live, and the slideshow of Sterling's financial ruin continued to cycle flawlessly on the giant screen behind him. Down on the main floor, Kiara was standing completely isolated in a sea of outraged socialites. Her wealthy friends were backing away from her as if she were carrying a plague. She looked down at her wrist. The heavy, solid gold Rolex she had been aggressively flaunting all evening suddenly felt like a branding iron marking her as an accomplice to theft. The realization of her absolute social annihilation hit her. She had been publicly humiliated in front of the very elite circle she worshipped. Her pristine reputation was dead, vaporized in an instant. Kiara looked up at the balcony, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. All the carefully cultivated elegance, All the fragile, weeping victimhood she had deployed in the courtroom completely vanished. She pointed fiercely up at me, her manicured fingers shaking with rage. "You lying, jealous bitch!" Kiara screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and echoing wildly over the chaos of the ballroom. She did not wait for security. She reached down, grabbed handfuls of the heavy silk fabric of her couture morning gown, and hiked the dress up above her knees. Kiara shoved past a stunned city councilman, kicked a stray champagne glass out of her path, and charged frantically toward the grand staircase, sprinting upward toward the balcony with murder in her eyes. I lowered the microphone, watching her come. I did not move a single inch. Let her run. I was just getting started. The heavy oak doors of the balcony burst open with a violent crack. Kiara tore through the threshold, her breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. She had ripped the hem of her expensive black morning gown, just to climb the stairs faster, the delicate silk now hanging in jagged shreds around her ankles. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged toward me, her hands curled into claws, ready to physically rip the microphone from my grip and tear the red silk right off my body. Before her manicured nails could even graze my skin, a second figure shoved violently past her. Beatrice had taken the service elevator. My mother moved with a terrifying, frantic speed I had never seen her possess. She slammed her shoulder into Kiara, knocking her own daughter aside to reach me first. Beatrice's eyes were wild, her perfect, pristine facade completely shattered by the absolute public destruction of her family's empire happening on the massive screen below. She planted her feet, twisted her torso, and swung her arm with every ounce of leverage she could muster. The open palm of her hand collided with my left cheek. The physical force of the blow snapped my head sharply to the side, but it was the sound that stopped the entire ballroom dead. I was still clutching the active wireless microphone near my chest. The sensitive acoustic receiver caught the violent, fleshy impact of the slap perfectly. It amplified the brutal strike, sending a sharp, echoing crack thundering through the Astor Ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system. The sound mirrored a gunshot ringing out in a crowded cathedral. A collective, horrified gasp rose from the 500 wealthy guests below. Mayors, corporate executives, and mega-church pastors all froze, staring up at the balcony in absolute shock. "You destroyed our family!" Beatrice screamed, her voice tearing from her throat, raw and hysterical. She pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You ungrateful, vindictive little monster. You destroyed everything we built." The stinging heat on my cheek radiated outward, a blooming fire of ruptured blood vessels. I could taste the sharp metallic tang of copper pooling against my teeth where my inner lip had caught against my jaw. I did not raise a hand to shield myself. I did not stumble backward. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head back to center, letting my cold, dead eyes lock onto my mother, for one fraction of a second before dismissing her existence entirely. I raised my free hand and lightly brushed a drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I stepped completely around Beatrice, treating her like a meaningless piece of furniture, and closed the distance between myself and my sister. Kiara was leaning against the brass railing of the balcony, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically between me and the angry crowd murmuring below. I brought the microphone directly to my lips. My voice flowed out over the massive speakers, calm, perfectly modulated, and utterly ruthless. "I did not destroy your family, Kiara." I stated my words, cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. I stared dead into her panicked, trembling eyes, refusing to let her look away. "Ask your husband why your name is listed as the primary guarantor on the $5 million church loan." Kiara's mouth fell open in a silent, jagged gasp. The blind rage burning in her eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by the hollow, freezing terror of a woman stepping off a cliff. I kept the microphone raised, my voice echoing off the gold leaf ceiling so that every single socialite, politician, and potential federal witness in the room could hear the exact parameters of her doom. "Ask him why he forged your signature on federal banking documents to secure his gambling markers. Ask him why your children's private school tuition checks bounced yesterday morning. He did not just steal from the megachurch, Kiara. He needed a legal shield when the federal auditors finally came knocking. He legally strapped you to massive corporate liability and federal wire fraud. If those casino loans default, you are the one going to federal prison." The words hung in the suffocating air of the ballroom. Below us, the angry murmurs of the crowd escalated into a deafening roar of outrage. The pastors were actively shouting, now demanding security, apprehend the men on the stage. Kiara froze completely. Her entire body went rigid, paralyzed by a sudden devastating paradigm shift. She slowly, mechanically turned her head to look over the brass railing. Her gaze dropped down to the grand stage. Sterling was no longer the confident, gleaming community developer commanding the respect of Atlanta's elite. He was backed into the corner of the stage, sweating profusely through his bespoke tuxedo. His silk tie was askew. His eyes were darting wildly around the room, searching for an exit route through the angry mob of betrayed investors. He was actively avoiding looking up at the balcony. He refused to meet his wife's eyes. Above him, the massive 20-foot LED screen continued to ruthlessly cycle through the high-definition offshore bank statements, highlighting the massive casino transfers and the fraudulent loan guarantees bearing Kiara's forged signature. The absolute truth slammed into her with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. She was not just married to a disgraced broke fraudster, she was his designated fall guy. He had built his escape plan on her impending incarceration. She looked at her wrist, staring at the heavy solid gold Rolex he had gifted her just last week, realizing it was purchased with stolen church funds, specifically to keep her docile and distracted while he secured his offshore accounts. A sound tore out of Kiara's throat. It was not a cry of betrayal or a weep of sorrow. It was a feral, guttural, animalistic scream of pure, unfiltered wrath. She completely ignored me. She pushed off the brass railing, hiked the shredded remnants of her designer morning gown high above her knees, and launched herself back down the grand, sweeping staircase. She descended the carpeted steps with terrifying speed, her expensive heels abandoned somewhere on the second-floor landing. She hit the polished marble of the main ballroom floor like a targeted missile. The wealthy socialites, prominent investors, and shocked politicians scrambled frantically out of her path, parting like the Red Sea to avoid the manic, screaming woman charging through their ranks. Sterling saw her coming too late. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender, backing up until his shoulders hit the LED screen displaying his crimes. "Kiara." "Wait, please, baby. Let me explain." Kiara did not hesitate. She lunged forward, launching her entire body weight at him. She tackled Sterling right in the dead center of the stage. The heavy wooden podium tipped over, crashing loudly onto the floor and sending promotional brochures scattering into the air. Kiara straddled his chest, her hands curled into vicious claws. She tore at his expensive tuxedo jacket, ripping the fabric and popping the pearl buttons off his dress shirt. She clawed at his face, screaming a continuous stream of obscenities that echoed through the vast hall without the need for a microphone. Sterling thrashed beneath her, desperately trying to protect his face from her manicured nails, begging for security to pull his wife off him. The pristine, untouchable, deeply religious image of the grieving family was literally tearing itself apart in a bloody, screaming brawl in front of 500 elite spectators. The mega-church pastors, who had been ready to hand over millions of dollars, watched in absolute stunned horror as the golden couple destroyed each other on the ballroom floor. From my high vantage point on the balcony, I watched the chaotic carnage unfold with cold, detached satisfaction. But my eyes did not linger on Sterling and Kiara's violent public breakdown. I continuously scanned the perimeter of the room, tracking the movement along the VIP tables. I found exactly what I was looking for: Reginald. While Beatrice was screaming at me on the balcony and Kiara was actively mauling Sterling on the stage, Uncle Reginald was operating with the cold, ruthless calculation of a veteran predator. He was a survivor. He recognized instantly that the social empire was dead, the legal shield was broken, and the money was gone. He was abandoning the sinking ship, and he was leaving his family to drown. I watched him drop into a low crouch behind the main VIP dining table, using the towering white orchid centerpieces to shield his movements from the panicked crowd. He reached under the heavy linen tablecloth and yanked out a massive monogrammed leather briefcase. I knew precisely what that briefcase contained. It held the initial physical donation checks, the cash envelopes collected during the VIP cocktail hour, and the last remaining untraceable funds from the estate accounts. It was his golden parachute. Reginald gripped the heavy briefcase tightly against his chest, tucking it under his arm like a football. He stood up, keeping his head down and his shoulders hunched. He wove expertly through the chaotic, distracted crowd, sticking to the dark shadows along the velvet-draped walls. He ignored the frantic screams of his niece echoing from the stage. He ignored the furious shouts of the investors demanding their money back. He was completely laser-focused on a single objective. He was heading straight for the swinging double doors located at the far left edge of the ballroom, the service exit. The exact same route I had used to infiltrate the hotel kitchen earlier that evening. I leaned against the cool brass railing of the balcony, my pulse steadying as I watched his desperate flight. "Run, Reginald," I whispered to myself, a cold smile touching my lips. "Run right into the trap." Reginald shoved past a group of fleeing, terrified socialites who were trying to crowd toward the main lobby doors. He slipped behind a massive ice sculpture, momentarily disappearing from view before emerging right in front of the heavy steel double doors leading to the catering alley. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, verifying that the angry mob was entirely focused on the domestic brawl happening on the main stage. No one was watching him. He was clear. He threw his shoulder against the swinging door, pushing it wide open to step into the chaotic, loud safety of the hotel's service kitchen. He expected to see frantic chefs rolling carts of dirty dishes and a clear path to the loading dock where he could disappear into the Atlanta night with millions of dollars in stolen cash. Reginald stepped through the threshold. He froze completely. The heavy double door swung shut behind him with a dull clicking thud, cutting off the screams from the ballroom. The bustling catering kitchen was dead silent. The chefs and waiters had been cleared out. Standing directly in his path, blocking the exit entirely, were three massive men. They were not hotel security. They wore dark tactical vests, heavily armored over solid black uniforms. Emblazoned across their chests in bright, unmissable yellow lettering was the acronym FBI. The lead agent stepped forward, blocking the dim light leaking in from the service alley. He looked down at the heavy leather briefcase clutched desperately in Reginald's sweating hands. "Reginald Vance," the agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising wall of federal authority. "Drop the briefcase. Put your hands behind your head. You are under arrest." The heavy latches of the leather briefcase hit the polished tile of the service kitchen, springing open upon impact. Bundles of $100 bills and thick stacks of endorsed cashier's checks spilled out, sliding across the wet floor in a chaotic mess of stolen wealth. Reginald raised his hands, his face a mask of sudden, paralyzing terror. The lead agent forcefully spun him around, slamming him against a stainless steel prep counter. The harsh metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoed loudly through the silent, empty kitchen. Back in the main ballroom, the violent chaos on the stage was abruptly intercepted. The side service doors flew open and a squad of federal agents swarmed the room. They marched straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floor, completely ignoring the gasps of the wealthy elite. Two agents physically peeled a screaming, thrashing Kiara off her husband. They tossed her aside, leaving her to stumble and collapse onto the steps of the stage. Sterling, bruised, bleeding from deep scratches across his cheek, and completely disheveled, gasped for air as the agents hauled him roughly to his feet. "You are making a massive mistake," Sterling panted, his voice cracking with sheer panic as an agent wrenched his arms behind his back and locked the steel cuffs around his wrists. "This is a private family matter. It is a civil probate issue. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here." I began my slow, deliberate descent down the grand, sweeping staircase from the balcony. Arthur Vance was absolutely correct this morning in probate court. I called out my voice, carrying clearly across the vast room without the need for the microphone. Georgia is a two-party consent state. The recording I made in Grandmother Vivian's hospital room was completely inadmissible in a civil hearing. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the heavy red silk of my gown flowing behind me as I walked purposefully toward the stage. Sterling glared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits. However, I continued, stopping just a few feet away from where the agents were securing him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not require two-party consent to open a preliminary criminal probe, especially not when a concerned citizen hands them credible documented evidence of interstate wire fraud, corporate racketeering, and international money laundering. The lead agent from the kitchen walked into the ballroom dragging a handcuffed Reginald by the bicep. The agent kicked the overturned mahogany podium out of the way, stepping directly under the glaring stage lights. "Sterling Vance," the agent declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement of tax-exempt funds, and federal tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." The Astor Ballroom, packed tight with the most powerful people in Atlanta, was locked in a state of stunned, breathless shock. Mayors, state senators, and business moguls were actively backing away from the stage, desperate to avoid being photographed anywhere near the collapsing Vance empire. Smartphone cameras were raised high in the air, recording every single humiliating second of the arrest. The pristine, highly manicured social standing of my family was completely disintegrating on live streams across the city. Beatrice let out a sudden, ear-piercing wail. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her legs completely giving out beneath her. The heavy, multi-carat diamond choker around her neck caught the harsh glare of the chandeliers, a sparkling mockery of her current reality. She stared at her brother Reginald in handcuffs, then at her son-in-law Sterling being read his Miranda rights. She gasped for air, her chest heaving in rapid, frantic spasms. Her kingdom was burning to ash right in front of her eyes. She scrambled to her knees, ignoring the ruined, expensive fabric of her gown, and glared up at me. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate defiance. "It does not matter," Beatrice yelled, her voice scraping against the walls of the silent ballroom. She pointed a trembling finger at my face, her teeth bared in an ugly, cornered snarl. "Let them arrest Sterling. Let them take Reginald away. We still won Zuri. We still inherited the estate. We inherited Big Mama's commercial property company and the Buckhead mansion. We own it all." She pushed herself up, swaying unsteadily on her designer heels, her voice growing louder, fueled by pure, blinding delusion. "I will hire the best defense attorneys in the country. I will sell the commercial real estate portfolio tomorrow morning. I will liquidate the mansion and the land it sits on. We will pay the bail, and we will crush you in federal court. Do you hear me? You are nothing. You are a broke, jealous little girl, and we are still millionaires." I stood perfectly still, letting her hysterical screams wash over me. I looked at her, truly looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, invisible, and unworthy. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just the cold, hard satisfaction of a perfectly executed forensic audit. I took a slow, measured step closer to her, the sharp click of my heel sounding like a gavel striking a sounding block. "You really should have read the fine print before you popped the champagne at the lawyer's office." "Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, icy register that forced her to strain to hear me. Beatrice blinked, her manic energy faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about? You were so desperate to take control," I explained, circling her slowly like a predator analyzing its prey. "You and Reginald were so eager to cut me out to force grandmother Vivian to sign the medical proxy to rush the transfer of assets before the bank could trigger a mandatory federal audit. You wanted the crown so badly that you refused to let me finish the financial review. You thought the physical ledger Reginald stole from me held all the answers." I stopped right in front of her, leaning in slightly so she could see the absolute, unshakable certainty in my eyes. "When you greedily signed the legal documents to accept the surface assets of the estate without doing a proper audit, you did not just take ownership of the properties. You legally assumed all the debts attached to them." Beatrice's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. Over by the stage, Reginald stopped struggling against the federal agents. He froze, his head snapping toward me, his eyes wide with sudden, dawning terror. He was the chief financial officer of the family. He knew exactly what corporate assumption of debt meant in the eyes of the law. You didn't inherit an $8 million empire, I said, my voice cold as ice cutting through the remaining silence in the room so everyone could hear. Grandmother Vivian was a brilliant corporate strategist. When she realized Sterling was embezzling from her company and that you and Reginald were going to betray her to protect him, she restructured everything. She used that obscure Delaware holding company to quietly leverage every single piece of commercial real estate she owned. She took out massive, high-interest corporate loans against the Buckhead mansion and the entire property group. She intentionally poisoned the well. I watched the realization hit Beatrice like a physical blow. Her knees buckled again, but I did not reach out to catch her. She slumped onto the floor, staring up at me with hollow, defeated eyes. You inherited a heavily leveraged, cross-collateralized shell company that owes $15 million to private aggressive creditors. I delivered the final devastating blow, ensuring my enunciation was flawless. There is no hidden equity to sell. There is absolutely no money for bail. The bank is going to seize the Buckhead mansion and auction the commercial properties by Friday. You are officially bankrupt. Beatrice hit the floor, letting out a hollow, broken sob. She curled into a tight ball, clutching her diamond necklace, as if it could somehow save her from the crushing, suffocating weight of $15 million in insurmountable debt. Kiara sat frozen on the stage steps, staring at her mother on the ground, her mind completely shattered by the sheer magnitude of their financial and social ruin. They had traded their humanity for an empire made of debt and ashes. Suddenly, a frantic, hysterical scream ripped through the air. Reginald was thrashing wildly against the iron grip of the two FBI agents holding his arms. His face was purple with rage and panic spit flying from his lips as he fought desperately to break free from their hold. He stared at me, his eyes bulging from their sockets. He had done the preliminary math months ago. He had seen the early ledgers before Vivian hid the money. He knew the liquid assets had existed at one point. But where is the real money? Reginald screamed, his voice cracking, bouncing wildly off the high gold-leafed ceiling of the ballroom. He planted his feet, physically fighting the agents who were trying to drag him toward the service exit. My mother had millions in cash. I saw the early accounts. Where did it go? I let Reginald's frantic, echoing question hang in the heavy, suffocating air of the Astor ballroom. The silence that followed his scream was absolute, broken only by the harsh, ragged breathing of my mother weeping on the marble floor and the sharp rustle of the tactical gear worn by the federal agents securing my uncle. Hundreds of eyes shifted rapidly from the handcuffed men on the stage back to me, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to drop into place. I reached up to the elegant neckline of my red silk gown. My fingers found the delicate, unassuming silver chain I had worn against my skin every single day since grandmother's passing. I pulled it upward in one smooth, deliberate motion. Hanging from the end of the bright silver link was the heavy, oxidized, rusty key. I held it up high, letting the jagged, archaic metal catch the blinding glare of the spotlights. It was never a key to a domestic bank box. I explained, my voice echoing with a cold, ringing clarity that reached the farthest corners of the velvet-draped hall. I looked down at Beatrice, watching her tear-streaked face twist in fresh confusion. You all spent weeks tearing apart her Buckhead mansion, illegally breaking into her private study, and aggressively bribing local bank managers to find a hidden vault that simply did not exist on American soil. This is a biometric clearance key to a highly secure private offshore vault in Zurich. Reginald stopped fighting the agents. His shoulders slumped, the remaining color draining from his face as he stared at the rusted metal dangling from my fingers. He understood immediately. The profound realization of his own utter failure washed over him. Grandmother Vivian was a pioneer, a visionary, and above all else, a survivor. I continued pacing slowly across the polished floor, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. 3 years ago, as she lay in that hospital bed recovering from her first minor stroke, her vision cleared completely. She realized that her own flesh and blood were nothing more than waiting vultures circling her legacy. She saw you, Reginald, quietly siphoning operational funds from the community charity accounts to fund your lavish lifestyle. She watched you mother aggressively plotting to seize control of the board of directors before she was even cold in the ground. And she knew exactly what Sterling was doing. She knew he was bleeding the church dry to feed his crippling offshore addictions. Beatrice covered her ears with her hands, violently shaking her head back and forth as if she could physically block out the truth. "No, no, no," she muttered hysterically. "She loved us. We were her legacy. We were the Vance dynasty." "You were her greatest disappointment," I countered, my tone dropping to a lethal, unyielding register. "So she established a blind trust." A collective murmur rippled through the rows of wealthy investors and corporate executives witnessing the spectacle. They were seasoned financial predators, and they understood the absolute impenetrable power of a properly executed offshore blind trust. It was a financial fortress. Over the course of 36 months, Grandmother Vivian systematically and quietly liquidated all of her real untainted assets. I declared, raising my voice to carry over the rising whispers. She sold the gold bullion reserves. She quietly divested her massive portfolio of blue-chip stocks. She emptied the legitimate interest-bearing offshore accounts. She poured every single cent of her actual liquid wealth into that blind trust, effectively hiding it behind layers of international corporate secrecy and impenetrable Swiss banking laws. She left you the surface assets, the public shell companies, and the heavily mortgaged properties, knowing you were too blinded by your own greed to ever conduct a proper forensic audit before signing the inheritance papers. I paused, letting the devastating brilliance of Vivian's trap fully manifest in the minds of my family. And she named a sole anonymous beneficiary to that blind trust. I said, a slow, razor-sharp smile spreading across my face. Me. Reginald let out a pathetic whimpering groan, his chin dropping to his chest as the federal agents firmly adjusted their grip on his arms. Beatrice stopped shaking her head. Her hands slowly slid down from her ears, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of absolute, unmitigated defeat. The millions she had bragged about, the immense cash fortune she had assumed she controlled, had belonged to me the entire time. I was the true heir. They had been fighting over a poisoned carcass. I turned my attention away from my ruined mother and my arrested uncle. I walked purposefully across the marble floor, ascending the short flight of stairs to the main stage. I stepped right into Sterling's personal space. The federal agents holding his arms stiffened slightly, but allowed me to close the distance. Sterling reeked of stale, terrified sweat. His slick, charismatic facade had entirely melted away, leaving behind a shivering, pathetic fraud. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Sterling," I murmured, keeping my voice low enough that only he, Kiara, and the agents could hear the intimate details of his destruction. "You thought you could leverage grandmother's commercial properties to cover your catastrophic gambling losses and hide it all under a mountain of fake LLCs and corporate jargon. But international creditors are not stupid. They are sharks." Sterling swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. "A few days ago, the massive hedge fund holding your toxic, fraudulent $15 million debt panicked," I explained, savoring the absolute terror radiating from him. "They saw the federal audits coming. They noticed the irregularities in the megachurch routing numbers. They wanted to offload those highly toxic assets immediately to avoid severe federal scrutiny and massive corporate liability. They were desperate to sell the debt to anyone willing to take on the risk." Sterling's breathing hitched. He stared at me, the final crushing piece of the puzzle slowly connecting in his panicked mind. "But here's the sweetest part," I whispered, stepping even closer, leaning in so he could see the relentless, unforgiving fire in my eyes. "My blind trust bought it. My offshore financial managers contacted your desperate fleeing creditors and bought your entire mountain of illegal cross-collateralized debt for pennies on the dollar." Sterling physically recoiled, staggering backward a half step before the federal agents yanked him upright. He let out a strangled, breathless gasp. I turned my body, slowly pivoting on my heel to ensure Beatrice on the floor. Reginald in handcuffs and Kiara trembling on the stage steps were all within my direct line of sight. The entire Astor ballroom held its collective breath. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were witnessing a masterclass in absolute financial annihilation. Beatrice stared up at me from her pathetic heap on the floor, her diamond choker looking like a glittering collar on a beaten dog. Kiara looked up at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. Her hands were shaking violently against the ripped shreds of her expensive morning gown. She finally understood the inescapable gravity of her situation. She was legally bound to the debt as the primary guarantor. She was facing federal prison time for wire fraud, and the only person holding the keys to her financial survival was the sister she had spent her entire life tormenting. I owned her home, I owned her cars, I owned her future. I let a bright, brilliant, entirely ruthless smile illuminate my face. I stood tall, the red silk of my dress blazing under the stage lights like a banner of victory. "I am not just the girl you threw out," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finalized authority, cold and sharp as a diamond edge. "I am your primary creditor. You owe me $15 million. Reginald's frantic, hysterical screams about the missing millions echoed uselessly through the ballroom. The federal agents did not care about his missing fortune or his shattered ego. They hauled him roughly through the service doors, his desperate protests abruptly silenced by the heavy steel snapping shut behind him. Sterling followed seconds later, dragged out of the Astor ballroom in handcuffs, his golden boy image permanently obliterated and his future confined to a federal cell. I ignored their departures entirely. My attention remained fixed on the two women left weeping on the polished marble floor. The reality of their total devastation finally overpowered their arrogance. Beatrice crawled forward on her hands and knees. She reached out with trembling manicured fingers and grabbed the hem of my red silk gown. "Zuri, please." Beatrice begged, her voice a wet, pathetic gasp. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot leave your own mother and sister out on the street. We have nothing left." Kiara dropped to the floor beside her mother, her ruined dress pooling in a messy heap around her legs. "We will do whatever you want," Kiara pleaded, fresh tears streaming down her scratched, tear-stained face. She clasped her hands together in a desperate prayer. "Just give us a fraction of the trust, a stipend, a small allowance. Anything. Please, Zuri, we are family. You cannot just erase us." I looked down at their desperate faces. I felt no warmth, no obligation, and absolutely no pity. I stepped backward smoothly, pulling the silk of my dress out of my mother's desperate grip. "When you left me to sleep on a hospital floor for 3 years, you said I was just a forensic accountant." I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing clarity. "You were right. I only care about the math. And the math says you have exactly 2 hours to vacate my properties." I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown. I pulled out a crisp, folded piece of heavy stock paper. I crouched down, maintaining fierce eye contact with my sister, and pressed the document firmly against Kiara's chest. It was the exact same eviction notice she had gleefully served me weeks ago. Only this time her name was listed as the defaulting tenant, and my offshore trust was listed as the executing landlord. Kiara stared down at the legal document, her jaw trembling violently as the absolute finality of her ruin set in. "Do not bother calling an Uber," I added, straightening my posture and looking down at them one last time. The cars belong to me now, too. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the grand exit. Behind me, the remaining members of Atlanta's African-American high society delivered their own swift, brutal verdict. The crowd physically parted, stepping far away from Beatrice and Kiara, as if they carried a deadly, contagious disease. Former friends averted their eyes in disgust. Corporate sponsors whispered harsh condemnations. The elite circle they had worshipped and sacrificed everything to impress instantly and permanently ostracized them. They were left completely alone in the center of the massive, glittering ballroom, sobbing uncontrollably over a worthless piece of paper. The subsequent weeks unfolded with surgical, relentless precision. Sterling and Reginald were denied bail, quickly indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement, and transferred directly to federal prison to await trial. Beatrice and Kiara were forcefully evicted from the Buckhead mansion by armed county sheriffs. Stripped of their designer clothes, their luxury vehicles, and their stolen funds, they vanished into the harsh obscurity they had always feared. No one in their former social circles answered their calls. I stood on the sprawling wraparound balcony of Grandmother Vivian's historic West End house. The warm Georgia sun illuminated the massive, beautiful renovations happening around me. The grand estate was no longer a silent, dusty museum dedicated to a fractured, greedy family. It hummed with vibrant life and focused purpose. I was actively restoring the property, transforming the expansive grounds and historic rooms into a state-of-the-art shelter and tech hub for young Black women. It was designed for brilliant, ambitious girls who just needed the financial resources and the secure safety net I had been forced to build for myself. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway drew my attention downward. A sleek black chauffeured Maybach pulled up to the front steps, idling quietly as it waited to take me to a board meeting with my new international partners. I smiled, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the silver chain around my neck. I reached up and curled my fingers around the rusty key resting against my collarbone. I looked up at the bright, clear sky. I finally shed a single happy tear, knowing without a doubt that I had secured Grandmother Vivian's true legacy.